Alright guys, so welcome to our first video lecture of the year. This is kind of later than what I had intended, and it's probably going to be a little bit weird for you, but what else would you expect at this point? So we're talking about fingerprints, and we start with this lovely, serious quote by my favorite author, Unknown. Fingerprints cannot lie, but liars can make fingerprints. So let that sit for a second. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to roll through some of this stuff a little bit quickly, but go in depth in areas where we haven't gone deep in class. Most everything that you're going to see in this lecture, we have already talked about to some extent, so I just want to make sure that we know what all is going to ultimately be on the test, and also that just so we have the good information. Now, what I had intended originally was to do kind of 3 small lectures over the course of several class periods, but we had some technical difficulties, so I'm going to actually make this a little bit larger than normal and cover all of the information. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to skip over some of this stuff. This is what your objectives of what you were going to learn, which most of you have already learned, and even a lot of our objectives here you should know at this point because you've done most of them. When it comes to prints, we've talked about when we have recorded prints, we did the rolled prints. We've already done lifting. We'll talk more about this in detail in just a second, but I do want to point out that there are different types of prints. When we're not just talking about fingerprints, you got palm prints, your lips are unique, your ears, different ways. We refer to this as biometrics. It's just a way to be able to identify people using parts of their body. And so it all kind of falls under that same biometric umbrella. Now, when we talk about fingerprints, it's not actually just the ridge pattern on the outside of your skin. Okay, remember that's when we talked about like destroying prints, that it actually is much deeper. And so we got this little cross section here of the skin, and what I want to point out is that you've got like your ridge islands on the top. That's your visible fingerprint. You've got your sweat pores, see the little dots there. Then you have that whole epidermis layer, which is your whole thick top layer of skin. Okay, is your epidermis. But then underneath your epidermis is where you have your dermal papillae. Okay, that is where your fingerprints are actually formed. It's just this kind of, all the ridges that you see on them underneath the skin. That dermal papillae is formed in that order, okay, and it stays in that order, and so it actually causes it to stick up through the epidermis, and where what you're seeing is you're seeing like the relief of that. You're seeing the outline of that dermal papillae. Then you have the dermis underneath that. You got your sweat glands and nerves and all that stuff. Okay, and so what I really want you to take away from that is the dermal papillae. That's actually where the fingerprints come from, and then they kind of push up through the epidermis. Now, when we talk about the history of fingerprints, there's a long history of it, and there's a couple of key people that I want us to know about. William Herschel is one. He was a British officer in India, and he was required people to put their fingerprints on contracts and started using it as a means to identify prisoners. Henry Faults was one of the first people to use fingerprints in a criminal justice aspect. More important, and what you really need to know is you need to know Alphonse Bertillon. Okay, Alphonse Bertillon. If you remember, we talked about his system. His system was called anthropometry. You need to know that term. And it was also referred to as the Bertillon system. That was one where there was a series of body measurements that were used. Okay, remember we talked about that in class, where they would measure your arm length, the circumference of your head, and all these things. There'd be this list of measurements that were unique to you. Really inefficient system, but it was the best thing that we had at the time. Francis Galton, he was the one who actually wrote the first book on fingerprints entitled Fingerprints, and he's the one who came up with that lovely loop, arches, and whorls, and so we can thank him for that and want to punch him later. Sir Edward Richard Henry was first person who came up with, well, at least not actually the first person. Vucetich came up with it a little bit beforehand, but Vucetich and Henry, they created classification systems. Vucetich for the Spanish-speaking world is still basically used. Henry's for the English-speaking world. So, now let's talk about those 3 fundamental principles of fingerprints that you would need to know. One, it's an individual characteristic, meaning that no other person in the world, as far as we know, with all of the odds that we've been able to calculate, no two people have ever been found to have the exact same ridge patterns on their fingerprints. So it is an individual characteristic. The second one, a fingerprint will remain unchanged during an individual's lifetime, from about 8 weeks or so in the womb to your deathbed. Creepy, I know. Your fingerprints will stay the same. At least the general pattern will stay the same. And then the third thing is that all fingerprints have these general characteristic ridge patterns that allow them to be scientific or systematically, classified. And that's what we've been talking about with all of our different patterns. We're going to look at minutia first. Okay, that ridge characteristics and minutia, those are interchangeable. You see, we have some examples here. You will need to be able to identify these. This is what actually makes your fingerprints unique. And you'll have at any given time 75 to 150 or more different particular ridge characteristics on your fingertips that make your fingerprint unique. It's actually these little imperfections, these little minutia that cause a fingerprint to look distinct from another fingerprint. And so we have some examples here. You guys have some examples in your notes. Ridge endings, islands, bridge, eye, enclosure, lake, or however we called it. Deltas, bifurcation. Hydrate real quick. You need to know these, be able to recognize them. Here's a little example where you can see some of these things. Let's see. I don't know if my cursor actually shows up on this. I think it will. Where you can see a little spur here. We got our delta. Scar lines. We didn't talk much about that, but scar lines, that's also minutia. Core is where it kind of ends in the middle. We got islands. We got a dot right here in the middle. Bifurcation, that's a really good looking bifurcation there. A double bifurcation where it splits and then splits again. Ridge ending, relatively straightforward. Now, let's go through our classifications real quick. Arches. Remember, arches do not have deltas. Okay, and the main characteristic of an arch is that the ridge lines start on one side and they go to the other side. And so, as you see with the arch, it starts on one side, goes completely to the other side, no deltas in the middle. You have your plain arch and you have your tinted arch. Tinted arch, it might look like it has a delta, but it's not really one. Loops, okay? Characteristics of it is that you have your lines start, they enter and exit on the same side. And they will have one single delta. Remember, radial opens towards the thumb. It's your radius. And ulnar opens towards your pinky, which is your ulnar bone. Ulna. Excuse me. All right. Whorls. The ones that we really want to slap in the face. Okay. So, what you have with whorls is you're going to have two deltas. And it says here, it says that the ridge makes a complete circuit. Okay, that it's going around makes a complete circuit. Plane and central pocket are the big ones to figure out the difference between. Remember, if the two deltas, if you draw a line and it intersects with any of these ones that are making this circuit, okay, then that's going to be a central pocket. If it does not, that's going to be, I just told you a lie, that's going to be a plane whorl. Okay? If you draw the line between them and it does not intersect with any of the ones making that circuit, then that's going to be a central pocket. Double loop, that's the one that looks like kind of a bowl of spaghetti, got two S's there. And accidental is the one where you just can't really figure it out. Now, we didn't talk much in class about the classification system, so basically what I want you to just know, I want you to know that Henry created the classification system for English-speaking, Vucetich for Spanish. We'll deal with that a little bit later. Now, one thing to know when we're talking about minutia is that there's no legal requirement for how many minutia points need to match. Generally, we do 8 to 12. Okay, and so when you're matching two fingerprints, you would find 8 to 12 things that lined up. Okay, latent prints. These are the ones that are not easily visible. This is where you got the secretions on your skin and the sweat and stuff is transferred. This talks about the 3 glands. We're not going to deal so much with the 3 glands. We do need to know that sebaceous, that's where that sebum oil comes from, and that you also have amino acids that are transferred. stuff like that. With developing prints, okay, you have two main ways to do that. You have a physical developing and you have chemical developing. Physical is going to deal with powders for the most part, and then we already talked about some of the powders, and I guess since this doesn't go into detail, we'll go over those real quick. We have the regular black powder, which would be used for a light-colored surface. Gray powder is a good neutral one that can be used on light and dark. We also have our fluorescent powders, which allow you to use UV light to see details that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. And also the magnetic powders, which are a lot cleaner and allow for you to kind of easily be able to get prints. Then we have our chemical methods. The oldest method, iodine fuming. Okay, we did that in class. That's the one that took just a minute. Had little kind of purple fumes coming up and caused the prints to be seen. That's iodine fuming. That's the oldest method that we've been using. It reacts with oils and fats, and it makes a temporary yellow-brown reaction that is reversible. That's key to know, that it is reversible. Ninhydrin. Our ninhydrin didn't necessarily work with all of our classes, but this is the most widely used one, is ninhydrin. And so that ninhydrin reacts with amino acids, which are kind of building blocks of proteins on your fingerprints, and it causes a purple color. Okay. Silver nitrate, we did not do that in class because I don't have any silver nitrate, but it reacts with the chloride. Okay, the silver nitrate reacts with the chloride and makes silver chloride, so it turns gray when you expose it to light. The last one that we did do in class is cyanoacrylate, which is the superglue fuming, okay, where you use the superglue. It reacts with the water and it basically forms a little superglue shell over those ridge patterns, and so you can see them. Now there is one other method, which is the use of lasers, okay. Lasers and alternate light sources. We obviously didn't do that in class, but that's one where we looked at the video of the Night Stalker, and they were able to use that green laser to find a print that they weren't able to find anywhere else. Here's an example of an iodine print. Okay, it looks pretty close to what we saw there in class. Here's an ninhydrin fingerprint, which I actually have an example of some prints I'll show you all in class for those of you who did not get to see the demonstration. Here's an example of the cyanoacrylate, the superglue fuming, where it just shows a lot of details. You can then go over and dust over those and then lift that print. Now, we're going to skip over the other prints right now, but I mean, it's neat stuff to know. One thing we didn't talk so much about is the APHIS system, but you need to know this. It's actually part of our TEKS of the class. It's the Automated Fingerprint Identification System. And so it started in the 70s, and what this allowed computers to take over the process of having to go through and find and figure out the fingerprints. And so it's a huge database. Right now I think we have like 55 million or so prints that are in it. And so they've been working over time actually to consolidate. And you have the FBI's, the IAPHIS. The FBI's Integrated Automated System, which is a national database that takes those cards. The last thing I want us to remember is when we talked about this goes back to the developing prints is, just a second. When we go back to the developing prints, is remember about lifting prints. We put the tape on it, we lift it, we put it onto a card. Sorry, I have students that are trying to come in. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this short. Any other information, I'll put it on I'll list it like written out underneath this video. All right, y'all have a fantastic day.